black thing go from left to right, and I thought, I'm going to die out here. No one's ever going to know. I couldn't believe what my eyeballs were showing me. I'll never forget how evil the eyes were. It was horrible. I mean, I've never seen nothing that evil.
It ran towards me at a rate that I can't even explain. Turned and stared at me, and this look of, I just want to kill you. I want to say it was human, but it wasn't.
He was yelling at me to grab a gun, grab a gun. I was like, for what? He said, just grab a gun. And there's footprints all the way to the door of my house. It had went inside my garage, all the way to the door.
911, what are you reporting?
Jesus Christ, you better...
Sir?
See ya!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Uh-oh.
You're listening to Sasquatch Chronicles. Check us out online at sasquatchchronicles.com. If you've had an encounter, email me. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. I know it's real, and what I saw is not a joke. It was not a person in a costume. It was really something that could move around. It could grimace its face. It was growling. It was very aggressive. So people can think what they want to. I know what I saw, and it was pretty bad. I don't want to think about it too long, because it scares me to this day. On November 1st, 1974, the Columbus Police Department received a series of panicked reports from several eyewitnesses, all who claimed to have seen and even been attacked by a huge bipedal green-skinned monster that stalked the waterways inside Indiana's 83-acre Millrace Park. These encounters would alarm locals and lead to what some considered to be the biggest monster hunt in the history of the United States. The first encounter involved 4 young women. At approximately 3 p.m. on November 1st, 1974, one of the young women spotted the thing between 2 trees near the paved boat ramp that led to the east fork of the White River, not far from where the Driftwood and Flat Rock River merge. The terrified teens wasted no time in escaping the park and reported the incident to law enforcement officials. They stated that they had seen a green, hairy, large creature. But this wouldn't be the last time the creature was seen. Later on that same evening, a pair of women, having heard nothing about the teenager's earlier sighting, decided to stop in the Millrace Park to chat and eat the fast food they had picked up. Only one of the pair to ever come forward regarding this event was Tyra Catalin. She related details of the incident. It was just a typical evening, shortly after Halloween, and we decided to take our dinner down to the park and eat it and talk. We were just kind of staring out into the dark woods. Out from the woods comes this thing. They had to have been at least 7 feet tall, if not taller. It was way taller than a normal man. It was beating on the windshield, trying to get in, and we were screaming. Through the battered and mucus-smeared windshield, Catalin finally managed to get a look at the monster. There was a greenish tinge to him, the thing's face. I don't know if it had been in the river, drinking, and it got moss on it, because there was so much slime on its face. It did have fangs, and it was trying to bite through the glass. And I was afraid he was going to tear the door off. Nothing has ever scared me as much as that. Finally, the driver of the car was able to compose herself enough to start the engine, and the pair made a quick exit. Like the teenage girls who had seen the thing earlier in the day, the women who did not know the girls, who had not heard their story, drove straight to the police station to report the monster. The police, according to Catalin, were no more prone to believing these older eyewitnesses than they had been with the first group. It seemed like they were laughing about it. They said, "Oh, monster? Really? Have you been drinking?" I said, "No, it's real. It's out there. You gotta go down there. It's out there, and it's going to get somebody." The skeptical officers started to change their tune about a monster lurking, because there was no denying the damage done to the car, or the horrific stench that surrounded it. This wouldn't be the last report to come in. Several reports had come into the Columbus Police Department, even by city officials who had seen the creature. The creature was being seen so much, the local media had picked up the story. Soon there were small local posses being formed, people going out with guns. The frightened locals were armed to the teeth and roaming around in the dark near residential areas. The city park director had ordered the park to be closed. The locals call the creature the Mill Race Monster, and it's still being seen today. Welcome to the show, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. Got a great show planned for you tonight. Kind of a quick history lesson on the Mill Race Monster, and I really only covered 2 encounters. There's a ton of encounters if you go look up during that time, and even up until this day, there's a lot of people seeing this creature running around that Mill Race Park. Dave was actually out canoeing, and he wasn't far from Mill Race Park when a very strange incident happened to him. And then we'll talk to Shane, who comes to us from Georgia. And Shane was actually out hunting, and the creature stood up right in front of him and 2 other guys and walked off. I hope you enjoyed the show tonight. If you've had an encounter, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. And if you get a chance, check out sasquatchchronicles.com. Let's jump into it tonight. I want to welcome Dave to the show. Dave, thanks for coming on.
Hey, glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you here. And I know your encounter took place in 2008 back in Indiana, and we talked a little bit about the Mill Race monster. If you would, though, Dave, would you kind of walk us into your encounter, tell us what you were doing and what happened?
Yeah, it was August of 2008. It was, the encounter happened about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I decided to go canoeing that day, and I didn't have anybody to go. When I've canoed the Flat Rock River numerous times by myself, so I didn't have any concerns about just going out. And it's about a 6-hour canoe trip. And so I started canoeing that day, and everything was as normal, like it always has been. And previously, weeks before, we had a lot of rain, and the rivers got up really high, and I started experiencing a lot of log jams that were created weeks earlier. And I finally got down about, I was on the Flat Rock River coming out of Shelby County, and I just crossed over into Bartholomew County, and I was about a mile from Mill Race Park on Flat Rock River, and came up on a log jam that I couldn't get around. And so I pulled my canoe over to the left side of the river and evaluated the situation, and it was just impossible to get around on the riverbank. So there was a dry creek bed where, when the water was high, it ran around a high grove of trees on the right-hand side, and then there was a heavy wooded area to the left, and the water went around that high area and then came back into the river itself. So walked down that creek bed a little ways, and saw that it continued on, that it didn't dead end. I would probably say the distance was 300 feet, but it was in a semicircle going around that high grove of trees. So once I figured out I was going to have to drag my canoe, I got my stuff packed in it and continued dragging it down through this rock bed, and it was making a tremendous amount of noise because I'm just dragging it on rocks. And next thing I know, I hit this stench. It was a smell that immediately made me want to vomit. I'd never smelled anything so horrible in my life, and brought me to my knees. I immediately thought I was going to vomit, and I got my composure back and finally got to the point where I could stand up, and I was looking around, and instantly I had fear that came over me, and really what the fear was is I thought that it smelled like a decaying body. And the first thing I thought of was that somebody had drowned or got caught in the high water and got swept back into this area, and that, that I was going to, find a dead body. I don't know how else to put it. And I think that's where my fear in my mind, that's what I was thinking. And as I kept looking around me and I didn't see anything, I started looking for dead fish, thinking that maybe some fish got caught back in there, and didn't see any dead fish either. So at that point, I just kind of shook it off and grabbed my canoe and was like, I got to get myself back on the river, and I started proceeding on. And about at that point, I heard to my left in the high grove of trees, the only thing that I can equate it to is it sounded like 3 deer that were bedded down, and I don't know how many of the listeners have ever jumped deer, but when they come springing up and busting out of a wood patch area, it makes a tremendous amount of noise, and that's what it sounded like. And so immediately, as soon as the what I thought were deer busting through this area, I immediately stopped because I wanted to see the deer. And at that point, when I stopped, it immediately stopped. And I realized at that moment that whatever was moving was focused on me. And at that period of time, that's when I had a tremendous amount of fear that came over me, because at that point I knew it wasn't deer. Wasn't certain what was going on because I never had any prior experiences, and I never studied Bigfoot or anything of that nature. That was literally the farthest thing from my mind. So at that point I started thinking about things like cougars and panthers and some type of predator, because at that point I knew it was watching me, and it was moving with me, and then it stopped suddenly when I stopped. And I knew that there was game cams that have shown that there's cougar that have come back down into southern Indiana, and literally that was the first thing I thought of.
So you hear this saying, it stops. As you're walking, it's walking, and what happens next?
Well, so I grabbed the canoe, and I knew at that point that from growing up and being around different animals, that if you got something that's going to get aggressive with you, if you show dominance, that's your best line of defense. Inside, what I wanted to do was I wanted to run back where I was coming from, but I'm out in the middle of nowhere on the river, and I had nowhere to go. And I knew that my only way to get out of that area is I had to get back on that river with that canoe. So what I did was this thought into my mind in a matter of seconds. Was to show some sort of dominance. So I just sucked it up and grabbed it front end of it and started my way down that creek bed towards the river, and doing it with authority. I'm hoofing it. And when I start moving, this thing starts moving to my left, and it is whatever it was, because at that time, I'm, again, not even thinking about anything to do with Sasquatch or Bigfoot or anything like that. It starts moving with me, so it's flanking me to my left, and the only way I can put it is it sounded like an elephant going through this tree line, and it's snapping limbs, and it's not snapping dead limbs, it's snapping green tree limbs, and as it snaps them, it sounds like a .22 rifle going off, and whatever it is, it's extremely pissed, and it is big. And one of the things, you know how it is when you can't see something, your eye goes to where the noise is coming from.
Yeah.
You'll look that direction. Well, I'm looking 8 to 10 feet up in the air. I'm not looking at my level. I'm looking up. So the noises that I'm hearing are coming from up above. And when I mean it's snapping limbs, and I'm not trying to over-exaggerate, but I bet you it snapped 50 to 60 limbs. I mean, it's snapping tree limbs, and it is, and I'm moving, and I'm dragging that canoe with, and I'm moving as fast as I can, not running. I'm trying to keep from looking terrified, which I was, and that's the only time in my life that I would ever use the word that I've been terrified. And it's snapping limbs, and it sounds like an elephant moving through. So as I keep moving down the creek bed, it starts curving back to my right, coming back to the river, and I finally see the river, and this thing's still moving with me the entire time. So I finally get to the river, and when I get there, it stops, and I get to the edge, and I get that canoe there, and when it stops, everything's dead quiet. And at that point, I stood there, and I was ready to jump in the canoe and just jump in it and get on the river, but when everything went quiet, and I felt a sense of, I guess, safety, because I'm standing by the edge of the river in my canoe, I decided to light up a cigarette, and I'm sitting there smoking this cigarette, and I'm looking, and I'm trying to wrap my mind, what in the world, is this this just happened, and I'm looking, and I can't see anything, and next thing I know, I hear this scream and this grunt, and this creek bed that I just walked through, it's probably 30 foot in the width of it. The next thing I know, after this thing screams and grunts, it gets a little emotional talking about it. It throws a piece of driftwood that was roughly 3 feet in length, in diameter. It was probably every bit of 36 inches in diameter. I guess the only way that I can describe it is I don't know anything humanly possible that could pick this up and do what I'm getting ready to describe. When it screamed and grunted, I saw this driftwood come flying out of the edge of the tree line where this thing was flanking me, and it throws it, and when it comes out of that tree line, it's 10 feet in the air, and it is a straight line shooting straight out of the tree line at 10 feet, and it went into a small grove of trees that were probably about 12 inches in diameter, and there was probably about 15 or 20 of them. And when it flies into it, it snaps the trees. It breaks them. At that point, when I saw that, I lunged and dove into my canoe and got into the center of the river as quick as I could. And I sat there for a minute, and the one thing that I noticed was that there was no wind blowing at all, and none of the other trees were moving anywhere. But the grove of trees where this piece of driftwood flew into and broke, they were violently shaking, and there was probably 20, 25 of these. And when I mean shaking, I'm telling you right now, they were swaying back and forth as if it was the hardest windstorm you could imagine. And they were swaying, and there was this hideous screaming noise, and these trees were just swaying back and forth violently. And at that point, I started moving down that river as quick as I could.
I would have too. What did you think was going on at the time?
Well, at the time, I couldn't wrap my mind around it. I literally couldn't. I didn't know. I really was just dumbfounded. I guess the best way for me to answer this is I got down the river, and I didn't talk about it for probably 4 years because I didn't know how to explain it. And like I said earlier, I never did any studying on Sasquatch. It was, I'm 52 years old. It's something that I've heard about, when I was younger, but it was always, one of those things that you heard about, and, it was from out west, and, being the age that I am, we didn't have the internet and stuff, when I was growing up. So, it's not like I just never investigated, never studied it. It was just something that you heard about. And like I said, I never, that was the furthest thing from my mind. So to get to the point, 4 years go by, and around 2012, 2013, I gave up television, and I started YouTubing different things, documentaries, bios, stuff like that. And one day I came across this eyewitness account YouTube video about a guy that had a Bigfoot sighting, and I never equated what I went through with anything until I watched that watched that YouTube, and then all of a sudden, what this person was talking about experiencing, and the same things that I've heard on your different podcasts with different people, was that the similarity with what I experienced. And I started saying to myself, holy cow, the stench, the snapping of the trees, the aggressive, violent behavior. And so one thing led to another, and I never knew anything about the Milray's monster. What I did one day was I was curious, once I saw that YouTube video, and I started thinking about what I went through, and so I Googled Bigfoot sightings in southern Indiana, and to my surprise, there was a lot. And so then at that point, I decided to Google Bigfoot sightings in Bartholomew County in Indiana. And that's when the Milray's monster came up, and I read that account. And what I found awful ironic was that I was only eighth to quarter mile from where that happened 40 or 50 years, earlier than my experience. And at that point, I said to myself, that's exactly what it was.
And that mill race monster, that does go back many years, and there's still encounters today. What I find fascinating, especially with the mill race monster, it seems to happen around that Flat Rock River a lot, around that waterway. That seems to be where most people run into it. And I think all the behaviors, it's interesting that it got so pissed off that it would throw a log. When it threw it, did it come close to you?
No, it actually, I guess the best way for me to describe it is I think what it got pissed about was that I did not continue to keep moving. That when I got to the edge of the river, I stood there by my canoe and, lit that cigarette and took about 3 drags off of it. And then, next thing you know, this thing screams and this tremendous grunt. And I know that grunt was from it, throwing that log, because as soon as I heard the grunt, that's when this big log comes flying out at 10 feet. And I'm talking with so much force that when it hit the trees, it snapped them. I mean, whatever trees it hit, it snapped them, it broke them. So I think, in my opinion, it was doing one last ditch effort to get me to keep moving, because I stopped and I was, standing on the edge of the river, and it was kind of like it wanted me out of that area.
Yeah, it's
Absolutely.
it's very territorial, very aggressive. You hear a lot of hunters I've had on the show where hunters are out and they will be paced out like how you were paced out. You stop, it stops. You move, it moves. And you hear that behavior constantly. And you're probably right. You probably figured, what are you doing? You're not, obviously it didn't scare this guy enough. It's time to scream and toss a log in his general direction to get him moving. I think a lot of times in those situations, if you don't leave, it probably would have stepped out, came out in the open. It was probably trying to conceal itself, be as territorial as possible without an altercation. But it makes me wonder if you wouldn't have left, if you'd have just stayed there.
Well, one thing that I will say is from where the log came flying out with the one that flanked me, there had to have been more than one, because the violent nature of the trees and the screaming that I heard, it came from the other side of that dry creek bed. So in my opinion, looking back on it, I think there was one behind me as the one was flanking me to the left when I was trying to get to the river, because there's no way from the time it threw that log, and I never took my eyes off of that area, for it to get over there to where those trees were at, where I heard the additional screaming and the trees violently swaying. And these are big trees. These aren't small, saplings. I mean, these trees were, I don't know, I would probably say, 25 feet in height and, 12 to 15 inches in diameter, the trunk, the size of the trunk, and like I said, there was about, 20 of them. And all of them are swaying, not just one of them. I mean, I'm telling you, they are violently being shook. So I think there was 2 of them. If I wouldn't have been dragging that canoe, that I don't know if I would have made it out of there. I've never been terrified in my life. That day I was terrified. I'd never had fear inside of me like I had at that moment. I felt like I was in danger. I think the only thing that saved me was it I don't know if it saw me on the river before I started, but I think it knew that I was trying to get to the river. I think if I was just walking in there, if I would have just been walking, I don't think I would have made it out. One of the things that I told you is, for 4 years I never said nothing. And then I started getting, started gathering information and started connecting the dots. And then basically one thing led to another, and I came across another gentleman that I met through a mutual friend, and out of the blue, my mutual friend said, "Hey, why don't you tell him about your Bigfoot experience?" And I thought he was making fun of me when he said it, and I just looked at him and said, "Hey, man, what's your point of doing this?" And he was sincere, and he said, "No," he said, "I really want you to tell him about your Bigfoot experience because he had one." And at that point, I looked at the guy and I said, "Well, why don't you go ahead and tell me what happened to you and first?" Because I didn't want to tell my story and then him, have something. I needed some validation. So he went ahead and told me, and he was in that area, there's another river called Driftwood. And Driftwood River comes together with Flat Rock River, and it makes White River, and they come together there at Mill Race. So these two rivers join. And this gentleman told me about his Bigfoot experience, and he saw one, and it was about 1 o'clock in the morning, and they were down at a boat launch area, and they had to take a leak, and they drove down into that boat launch area at about 1 in the morning and turned the car off. And he said he was, using the restroom, and he was just standing there, and said it was just dead silence. Next thing you know, he heard movement, looked to his left, and saw a creature on two legs that was walking towards him through a wood line and crossed a small creek that was kind of like one of those overflow creeks that come off of the main river line. And he said that he was there earlier, and he knew that was about 5 feet. He said it was up to his chin was how deep that creek was. And when he watched that Bigfoot, or, he said a creature, he said it was walking on two legs, and when it crossed through that water, he said it was only about waist deep. And he watched it walk down through it and watched it walk up out of it, and it walked up through a tree line and crossed the road and kept migrating. And he saw it with his own eyes. And so that area is only about a couple of miles from Flat Rock River area where I was at. I think they migrate the rivers.
Yeah, it's possible. It's interesting because there is a lot of encounters around that river and around the waterways through there. I've had a lot of encounters sent to me. I've read a lot of historical accounts through there, and there's a lot going on down there. Do you still go canoeing, or have you been back to that area?
Well, no. Well, yes and no. So, yeah, to answer your question, my entire life, as a young kid, like I said, I'm 52. When I was 10, 11 years old, that's back when fur brought money, fox and mink and muskrat, and we used to make a pretty good living when I was a kid, and I had a trap line of 40 or 50 traps, and I'd run it every morning at 5 a.m. in the morning, and I would walk my entire trap line down along the Flat Rock River as a young kid and never thought nothing about it, and trapped, and I've, hunted my entire life and fish on the river, walk back on the river by myself and spend all day, fishing. And to be quite honest with you, I've quit. I don't hunt anymore. I definitely will not walk into the woods by myself any longer. I will canoe, but I won't canoe without somebody being with me. I won't canoe by myself, and I won't canoe any longer without having firearms with me. Like I said earlier when we talked, it's not that I think that I would be able to kill one, but if I'm gonna lose my life, I'm gonna do it with a fight. And that day I didn't have anything with me. I didn't have a gun. I didn't have nothing. But after what I went through, you wouldn't catch me canoeing without a couple of firearms on me.
Yeah.
And I won't canoe by myself.
Well, that's probably for the best anyway. Monsters and Sasquatch aside, bad things can happen on a river, you know what I mean? Especially when you're canoeing.
Yeah. It's an active area. And then the other thing I wanted to add also real quickly is, so after that, the house that I own in Columbus, my house that I own is only maybe an eighth mile from Millrace Park. And the Flat Rock River runs behind where my house is located. Now, my house doesn't set right on the river, but it runs back behind. And I would say, as far as distance, I'm probably a quarter of a mile from the river, maybe eighth mile. And there's a bunch of houses behind me. It's an area called the Lagoons. And I sleep with my windows open during the spring and during the summer. If it's not, really humid outside, I don't run air conditioning. I keep my windows open. And I've had many a night that I've been asleep, and around midnight to 1 a.m, you can hear tree knocks. I've heard stones being pounded together where it almost sounds like gunfire. And screaming howls where, and when I tell people, or when I've asked people, hey, did you hear that last night? And I tell them what I've heard, everybody always wants to say, oh, it's probably a bobcat or a coyote. But I'm telling you right now, it sounds just like the vocalizations that I've heard, on YouTube, just pulling up different information that I've been able to pull. But I'm just talking gut-wrenching screams in the middle of the night coming back from on the river.
Yeah, it sure seems like an active area, that's for sure. And it's a terrifying account that you had, Dave. I mean, when you're alone and, what else could it be? It's not a person, it's not a bear. And then you start looking at the history of that area, and it's notorious for sightings. I mean, absolutely notorious for sightings. I know sometimes it's hard to wrap your head around what happened to you, and sometimes it's hard to talk about it, but I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show and talk about it.
It was my pleasure. I enjoy your program, and it's nice to hear regular people on your program giving their testimony of things that they've experienced. Because, you really question yourself when you experience something like that. And, so to listen to different people throughout the country with similar experiences is comforting, I guess is a good way of putting it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again, Dave.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Well, next up, I want to welcome Shane to the show. Shane, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And I know you had an encounter when you were out hunting. It was in Georgia, wasn't it, Shane?
Yeah, it was. Sure was.
Okay. Well, if you would you start from the beginning? Tell us what happened and what did you see?
Okay. Well, the sighting actually occurred. It was in November of 1991. I was still in high school. I hunted with an older gentleman by the name of Hubert. At the time, he was in his mid-50s. And the overseer of this property that we hunted, Ray, he lived on the property, so he kind of tried to watch over things for the owner. But once I got to know Hubert, I had talked with Hubert and hung out with him for a couple months before the first time I went hunting with him. And the first time we went hunting, we were going down to the hunting property, and it was about a 2-hour drive to go from where Hubert lived to the hunting land. And he was telling me, he told me, Shane, buddy, he goes, I'm not trying to scare you or anything like that. He said, but we have some kind of strange happenings going on down here on this property. And he said it's been like that ever since he started hunting down there. Well, at the time I didn't think nothing of it, and got down there to the property and got Ray, because he always would go with us. And we had about, well, I say we, Hubert had about 3,200 acres, give or take 100 acres that we had permission to hunt. And as far as I know at that time, the only people that had keys to all the gates on the property was the owner and Ray, which was the overseer, and Hubert. So we had a bunch of places we could unlock the gates and go in. Well, I had been hunting with Hubert for probably almost a year when we all three had this sighting that I'm fixing to relate. But there was some strange goings on prior, within that year or so before the sighting. We would hear strange vocalizations from time to time. Hubert was a real avid outdoorsman. He pretty much grew up in the woods. He was in the Marine Corps for, oh Lord, I couldn't tell you how long, for years and years and years. And so he was real knowledgeable on the animals and stuff that was in this area that we hunted. And he would always tell me, he said, Shane, he said, that's not a bobcat, that's not a coyote, that's not a fox, that's not anything. And the biggest animals that I know of that was down there, we had some wild hogs down there. They get pretty good size, but other than wild hogs, we had white-tailed deer, of course, and that's about the biggest animals that we that was down on that property in that part of Georgia. Like I said, we had heard some vocalizations and things like that, and there were a couple occasions as well to where we actually had some rocks thrown at us, and several times we had run into this real strong pungent odor. It's hard for me to describe, but I guess you would call it was like a cross between what I would call a pig pen, a wet dog, and just nasty rotten eggs and just all kind of stuff put up together. And the first time I ever smelled that, we all three smelled that first time, for first time for me, not first time for them, but first time for me. And I said, that must have been old polecat or something. That's just what down here a lot of us old country boys call a skunk, an old polecat. And he said, buddy, he said, that's not a polecat. And he said, I can tell you that. But we smelled this odor, from time to time, and had rocks thrown at us and stuff. But this particular night that we had the sighting, we got down to the property, and when we went into the gate at this location was an old road. If you didn't have a four-wheel drive truck or a four-wheeler, you couldn't get in and out of it. But when Hubert always get out and lock the hubs on the truck so we can get down to the land. But we would probably drive close to a quarter of a mile down through the woods, and then there was a small open clearing where we parked. And when we would pull up, on the right was a big creek. It wasn't a river. It was pretty wide and pretty deep, but it wasn't big enough to be a river. But like I told you earlier, when it did rain, there was no way for us to cross it, and most of the time the water was about knee deep. But it was cold night in November. We got our gear on, got everything suited up, and turned the dogs out of the dog box. It's typical night, for us, and we started making our way into the woods. Now, this particular place was one of our favorite places to turn the dogs out. And, of course, Hubert and Ray had been hunting this land for years and years before I ever started hunting with them. And I would think it was about a year that I had known Hubert and started hunting with him when this encounter took place. But turned dogs loose. We start walking down into the woods, and the woods are pretty thick. And like I said, you got a big creek on your right-hand side, and there's some small rolling hills that are wooded that's on the left side as you're going in. And we had turned out so many times at this place that we just had a big old path that was walled out by us by walking in there. And it was at times that at certain places, you could get 3 people shoulder to shoulder, with just walking along, listening to the dogs and waiting for the dogs to strike up and stuff. But I'm not really sure how far down in the woods we were at that time. We was pretty good ways in, because I remember we crossed a small creek that ran into the bigger creek. And a lot of times we stopped and get water from there, just from being thirsty and all. But we were pretty far deep in the woods. We started hearing something behind us, something rustling around. If we turned around, it would have been on the left of this path. So we had this big, thick patch of woods that run all the way through between the path that we would take to come in and the big creek. And we had heard it, and we'd walk, we got to keep the dogs within hearing distance, because at that time we didn't use tracking collars or anything like that. Hubert couldn't hear very well, and so I was his ears to keep the dogs in hearing distance and tell him which way we needed to go, wherever the dogs were working the track. We'd have heard this several times behind us, and at times it seemed like it would get closer and closer. And we'd stopped, and Hubert said, he said, it better not be one of them dogs coming back, because at the time, all the dogs that we had red-bone coonhounds. Every dog that we had was either a night champion or a grand night champion. I would argue that at that time, in the super early 90s, that they were some of the best coonhounds in the state of Georgia at that time. Won a bunch of competition hunts with these dogs, but we knew these dogs wouldn't come off of a trail, and especially when they got a raccoon tree, they would not come off the tree until we were there, and we had to leash these dogs on the, put tree leaves on them to lead them away, because we hardly ever killed any raccoons. We were in it for the pleasure of being out in the woods, friendship with each other, and listening and watching the dogs work. That's what we were into. It wasn't about the kill for us, because that's just the way we were. We didn't care anything about it. But Hubert made that comment about the dog coming back, and I told him, I said, Hubert, buddy, I said, that's not one of the dogs, because I had hunted with these dogs for so long, and any old coon hunter or rabbit hunter, a squirrel hunter that hunts with dogs, you can have 10 dogs, and you know these dogs so well by their voices that you can tell which dog is which just by the sound of their barking. And when they change their barks, it means that they're doing different stuff. And you can kind of tell what the dogs are doing just by listening to them, because they're telling you by their barks what they're doing. I told Hubert, buddy, that's not one of the dogs that's come back. And he said, and I told him just a little bit after, I said, Hubert, I said, dogs are going. I said, we gotta get closer to the dogs. And so we kept on going through the woods, and still, time to time, hearing stuff rustling in the woods behind us. And at this time, we were still on the trail, because that trail that we had in there, it went forever. And it pretty much stayed with the creek. Pretty much the creek was on our right side, the big creek, just about the whole time, unless the dogs crossed it, then we would have to cross it ourselves to go after the dogs. But Hubert made another comment. He said that might be one of them old wild hogs. He goes, I don't know. And he said if it starts getting any closer, he said we might have to do something about it. And I thought, okay, when we continued our hunt, listening to the dogs, it got pretty loud. it wasn't too far away from us at that time. And Hubert just jokingly, Hubert was a really good guy, and he was a real light-hearted guy, but he took most things pretty seriously. But this time he just jokingly laughed and said, he goes, "All right, boys," he said, "y'all get ready to turn them lights on," because most of the time when we walked, if we had a little bit, let's say, of the moonlight or something, we wouldn't even turn the lights on. We just leave them off, let the dogs do what they're going to do, and just walk by moonlight. But we did have the lights on and off up to this point, and Hubert jokingly said, "Is right, but boys," he said, "you all get ready to turn them lights on and shine them spots down there." And he said, "If I don't like what I see, I'm going to start shooting." Well, Hubert carried a .22 rifle with us every time we went into the woods. And it wasn't really necessarily to shoot a raccoon out of a tree, because we hardly ever took any at all. But he was just used to carrying some type of firearm in the woods. And he was the type of guy, too, that he carried a .357 Magnum under the seat of his truck wherever he went. He was just the kind of guy that he was. But Hubert says, "All right, I'm going to count to 3. Shine your lights down there." Okay, well, okay. And he was just, lightly hearted saying it. He wasn't really being serious or anything. He was just, trying to make light of the situation. We counted to 3, and Ray and I turned on our high beams on our lights. That's when we had the sighting when we saw it. I would say that it was probably, and I had mentioned this earlier, and I'll say it again too, but there's places on this path that 3 literally grown men can walk shoulder to shoulder and walk through just perfectly fine. Still have a little bit of room. But when we turned those lights on, that's when we saw it. And there's absolutely no way that was a bear, or there definitely wasn't anybody in the costume. For one, people couldn't just get in there anytime they wanted to. It's a hard place to get to, for one. And messing around with some old country boy coon hunters, at nighttime, that's not a good idea. Cause some of these guys, they're kind of iffy.
Yeah, it'd be suicide going out there in a costume, especially in an area. I mean, how would you know if someone's going to come through that night? Right there with you guys. Mm-hmm. What did you see though, Shane? What is it that you saw?
What I saw had to be a Sasquatch, but what I saw of it, this happened really fast. I would say it was between 7 and 7.5 foot tall. It wasn't it was big bodied, because I only saw it from the side, but you could tell that it was, of course, in a human form, but it was much bigger. And I do remember that the arm that I saw when it stepped across this path was much longer than what a human arm would be, a full-grown man's arm, proportionately. But it took one step over the path, and then it hit the woods going up towards the hill. But what I saw was, like I said, 7.5 foot tall. The hair or fur on it was a dark brown. It wasn't black, and it wasn't a real light brown, but it was a dark brown. I never saw the face. It never turned while we had it in the spot to look at us. It never did do that. But when it walked and took that step across the path, it was stooped forward. And the best thing that I can compare it to as far as other supposedly Sasquatch footage and stuff, it was real close to Patty from the Patterson Gimlin film. It wasn't exactly the same, but it was a little bit different, but it was close. The hair looked to be longer than what was on Patty. Its head, from the side view now, because I never saw it any other way except from the side, it wasn't as quite as conical, I guess you would say, as Patty in the Patterson-Gimlin film or other witnesses have seen their different Sasquatches. But it wasn't rounded like a human's either. And like I said, all this happened really quick. And when it stepped across that path, it did it with one stride. It was like, you know, it was in one side of the woods, and boom, just that quick, it was in the other side. And it went up the hill. This is when we were turned around, which makes the creek would be on our left at this time, and the hills was on the right side. Now, when this thing went through, you could distinctively hear at that time heavy footfalls going through the leaves and breaking limbs and stuff that was on the ground. And you could also hear what it sounded like it was busting through tree limbs as it was going up the hill. Now, this creature did not, at that particular time on this night and this sighting, it did not make any vocalizations whatsoever when we seen it prior or after. We never heard any vocalizations whatsoever with it. But we could hear it going through up the hill and started down the other side of the hill, and then everything got, real quiet. And we were all standing there like, we were scared on one hand, but on the other hand, we weren't, if that makes sense. At least I felt that way. And I was just like 18 years old when this had happened, but it made no threatening gestures or anything whatsoever. It's just like when the light hit it, it was like it just wanted to go. It wanted to get away from there, and that's exactly what it did. But we were standing there kind of awestruck and all, and Bray at that time, he had made a comment. He goes, "That's that werewolf." He said that I hear howling out here. He said, even when y'all are not here. He said, I hear it at nighttime and stuff, but he always said he was a werewolf.
I'm curious, what did Hubert say? He had mentioned to you, hey, we got a lot of strange things going on out here, which sometimes is code for I know what's going on out here, but I don't want to tell you because I need a hunting buddy. But did Hubert ever say what he thought it was?
Well, afterwards, we did discuss it on the truck ride home, because we had like a 2-hour drive to get back to his house. And he did say that that was a Bigfoot. He did say that. But see, to the best of my knowledge, Hubert had actually never saw it until that night. Now, he had seen footprints, and he had heard, which I had too, heard, vocalizations and stuff in the woods. And we had sticks at times thrown at us, rocks thrown at us at times. And this preceded me before I started hunting with Hubert. He had been hunting there for, oh my goodness, probably close to 4 or 5 years, I think. He had been hunting there prior to me meeting him and getting to know him and to start, going and hunting with him. But Hubert never fired a shot. He had that 22. Well, what are you going to do with a 22 rifle, get something like that? You're just going to take it off, if anything. But Hubert never fired a shot at it. And I did ask him later on why he did not fire a shot. And he said, for one, that he was almost in shock, because that was the first time he had ever seen that creature. He had heard it and seen footprints, but that's the first time he ever seen it. He said, and another thing, he said, we just saw it from the side, didn't see its face or anything. And honestly, I don't remember the profile of the face. I just don't remember. Honestly, I probably didn't pay that much attention at the time. But he did make the comment that it looked human to him, and he didn't want to shoot it. And then that's when we decided, well, we might need to gather the dogs and just load them up, go back home. And that's essentially what we did. Now, Hubert had told me a story at one time, and this was before we ever had that sighting. He said that him and Ray was out there hunting one night, and one of his dogs come back to him, and that's just something them dogs didn't do. But when the dog came back, he said that it had claw marks on the side, and I told him, I said, did it tangle with a bobcat or something? Because that's what I was thinking, the bobcat's about the only thing around, that's got really claws like that, not a deer, and of course not a wild hog. And he told me, he goes, I don't know what it was that got a hold of that dog, but the dog was injured, but not really, really bad. So evidently the claw marks on it wasn't like it was real deep or anything like that. But he did tell me that they gathered up the dogs, and he went home and he had the doctor that dog, its wounds and stuff. But I do remember one time we had went in at another location, and there were two ponds, and there was just a small built-up earth separating the two ponds. And this was probably, I would say, probably about a month or so after we had that sighting, to where we were standing between the two ponds listening to the dogs work. Evidently, I don't know if it was the same creature, if it was another one, but something started pelting rocks our way, and they were hitting in the pond. And Hubert was like, well, here we go again. And I just said jokingly at that time, I said, well, it just don't want us in this area right here for some reason.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Ray saying that there's werewolves out there. I was talking to a hunter in, I think he was in Alabama. And this is and when I say country boy, I mean, when the end of the world comes, this is a guy you want to be with. I mean, he literally lives out there. And he made that comment to me too. And I said, what makes you think werewolves? And he said, you hear him howl and you hear him scream, and it's no other animal. And it's interesting that Ray said the same thing, werewolf. I wanted to ask you, when this thing got up and it walked across the road, it obviously did it like a man. It was up on two legs, and one step it went across. Why do you think it?
Yes, sir.
Do you think it was just trying to exit and just leave? It didn't really, because it kind of sounds like it was around you guys as you guys were walking down the trail. From what I get from what you said.
Yes, sir. Yeah, that's what I gathered too. That it was staying in, not up close, but it was keeping us, within a certain distance from it. But yeah, when those lights hit it, all it wanted to do was leave. And now, and I will note this. This is something that I didn't note at the time, but I did afterwards. We never smelled that pungent odor like we had before when we, on many occasions. We did on many occasions afterward too. But this particular night, when we saw this creature and we had this sighting, I did not smell anything out of the ordinary. So, and I have listened to many people talk about Sasquatch encounters. And of course, it fascinates me to listen to people's encounters. But what I have noticed on a lot of these, people do smell a strange odor. And sometimes they don't smell a strange odor when they have a pretty close encounter. So I'm wondering if it's like some type of maybe a scent gland that they have, and they kind of give it off to kind of like a defense mechanism or what. But like I said, when we saw that creature that night, it made no attempts to try to charge us, or it didn't do anything like that. It just like it wanted to get out of there. And but no, I never smelled any odor that night.
Yeah, I think a lot of times with the odor, I think it's 50-50. I mean, sometimes people smell it, sometimes they don't. You know, it's kind of hit and miss. And there really seems to be no rhyme or reason behind the smell, to be honest with you. Sometimes people smell it, sometimes they don't, you know. I'm curious, Shane, what do you think Sasquatch is after seeing this thing? What's your honest opinion? Obviously, you know there's no wrong answer because no one truly knows. But what do you think that they are?
Honestly, I don't really know what they are. This is the way I look at things when it comes to things like Sasquatch and other cryptids, you know. But for Sasquatch especially, I just feel that whatever these creatures are, that God put them on this earth just like He did everything else. That's just how I feel. Could I be right? Maybe. Could I be wrong? Yeah. But I just honestly, I do not know exactly what they are. I just have no clue what they could be exactly.
Yeah, it's frustrating,
isn't it? I know some people think they could be a missing link between man and ape and things like that. It's possible. I just don't know what they are. I wished I did, but, you know, I don't think none of us really know for sure what they are exactly.
Yeah, it's frustrating.
And it seems to be that, yeah, it is. And it seems to be that in different areas of the country, there are differences in them, appearance-wise, anyway, you know. And so maybe they're just they're like people in a way, I guess, how, you know, people have different attitudes and people have different dispositions and people look different, you know. Maybe it's the same with them, being people have in different parts of the area of the country, how Sasquatches differ and all in their descriptions and how they look. Some having a conical shaped head and some not having a conical shaped head, some having longer hair, fur, and some having shorter hair and just things like that, you know. So honestly, I just don't know what they are. Of course, I would love to know, and I think anybody that's interested in the subject with that, you know, would love to know as well.
Yeah, I think once you answer that one question, what are they? I think it answers about all the other 50,000 questions we have.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it's I was just talking to someone the other night, and we were talking about how, you know, is it an ape? Well, I got about 50,000 questions that can tear apart that theory in 2 seconds. Is it a human being? Well, I got about 50,000 questions that can tear apart that theory too as well. And it becomes so frustrating. And I think once we find out what they are, I think there's going to be that aha moment where other things will kind of make sense, you know what I mean? But it didn't prevent you from hunting. I realize it wasn't really aggressive, just kind of got up and walked off. But you guys continued to hunt, didn't you?
Oh, we sure did. I probably hunted with Hubert in that area from maybe a year and a half, 2 more years until I was busy and I couldn't turn loose. I had graduated high school at that time and I was working full time and things, you know, it just kind of, and over the years, me and Hubert had lost contact with each other and stuff. But yeah, we still hunted out there for a long time, and we never saw it again. But you know, there was different times afterwards where we smelled that strange odor again, and times when we would have some rocks thrown at us and things, of that nature. But Ray had talked about seeing footprints on the property before, and so did Hubert. Hubert told me one time that him and his son really didn't fool with hounds. He wasn't really into coon hunting or anything like we did and all, but they had a cabin down there, not a cabin, a camper down there close to the creek. And where they had it set up at, it was a little sandy, not real sandy like, right on the edge of a creek bank was. But Hubert had told me that he went down there one time, of course I wasn't present, to go down and check on the hunting cabin because him and his son was going to do some deer hunting down there, and that's where they stayed. And he told me that he found footprints that went all the way around the cabin. Went all the way around the camper. I don't know why I keep saying cabin. But went all the way around the camper. And he did tell me, too, that it went out the same way that it had come in. And he said he guessed it was just curious as to, what was down there and what was in it. But the whole time that I hunted down there with Hubert and Ray, I never saw any footprints. And if Hubert told you that he saw footprints, because I got to know Hubert and his whole family really, really well over the years. And he was a really good stand-up, honest type guy. Like I said, he was an ex-Marine and stuff like that. But if Hubert told you, something, you could pretty well take it as fact. That's just the way the guy was, just a real upstanding guy. And, of course, Ray, the overseer of that property, he had seen footprints, too. And, of course, they evidently never thought about casting any or just wasn't interested enough, in it or the subject to want to make any castings of the prints or anything. So, I wish they would have, because I would have loved to have seen them, but
yeah, that's usually
if Hubert said they were there, they were there.
Yeah, that's usually the way it goes with those guys. You know what I mean? They're not like Sasquatch researchers or investigators. They could care less. They're going out to hunt and stuff, and you come across those tracks. I've talked to many of those guys, but I love hearing from hunters, Shane. They're my favorite. I've said it in the past. They're one of my favorite guests to have on the show, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share the encounter very much. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it. Greatly appreciate it.
And that's it for tonight, everyone. Remember, if you've had an encounter, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. And if you get a chance, check out sasquatchchronicles.com. You can become a member, get additional shows. I will see everyone next time.
So I put my spirit a little wiser.